We're going to give it a few more seconds, but in the interest and fairness to the panel, I want to get them started as close to on time as possible, since we usually stand up and tell them they have to stop on time. So I wasn't kidding. I was serious when I was talking to Katie, and I was saying I view this as the panel on application. So we have been talking for a day and a half now about engineering and human rights, the intersection of engineering and human rights. And Lindsey, no pressure on you, but based on the title, Integrating Human Rights Principles into Systems and Product Design, I, as one who, pretends to be an engineer and a scientist, I'm hoping that you're going to help us understand how we take the principles and other things we've talked about for a day and a half, and how do we really put them to work? How do we apply them to the work that we're doing? Because for some of us who work in the engineering field, and I can only speak for myself, we never really gave it serious consideration before. And that's, for some who may not know it, that's sort of the genesis of this symposium. I've been asked by several people, how did you all come up with this symposium, and why did you decide to have it? Especially because some people said they'd never been to anything like this before, which startled me. But the reason we had it was we were sitting around in two different groups, the Committee on Human Rights, who talks about this all the time, and then Caesar, which is, it's been around a while, but I had never heard of it in the Academy until they put me on the committee, and then I had to find out what we do. And it turned out we're supposed to be doing stuff to promote the kinds of things that we're talking about in these panels over the last day and a half. So it's my pleasure to introduce Lindsey Andersen, who's going to moderate this panel. And Lindsey is the Associate Director for Human Rights, Business for Social Responsibility. So Lindsey, elucidate us.
Great, thank you. Hi, everyone. Oh, now you can hear me. Great. Okay, great. Hi, everyone. Glad to be here with you all today. So I work at an organization called BSR, Business for Social Responsibility, on a team that works at the intersection of technology and human rights. And most of our work is working with tech companies to integrate human rights thinking and principles into how they develop, design, deploy, sell, and use technology. And one of the things we do a lot of is conduct human rights assessments of tech products to identify what human rights risks exist and help the company figure out to address them. And something that comes up almost all the time in that work is how choices related to product design really impact the human rights risks that exist for a product, whether that's what the user interface looks like, what kinds of data is collected or used by a system, choices about system architecture, choices about what kinds of information is shared with users, et cetera. And just to get a little more specific there, one example we sort of often see with AI systems in particular are risks to privacy related to the data that's used to train or update an AI model, or discrimination risks associated with outputs of an AI model that perpetuate historical biases in their training data. And these are all types of risks that stem directly from choices about product and system design, and so mitigating them also requires taking action at that level. And so that's essentially what we're going to dig into today. And I'm here with some really great panelists who all come from different backgrounds, but all have super interesting experience and perspective to bring about integrating human rights into product and systems design, whether that's from a mechanical engineering perspective or developing AI products and services. So I'm going to have them each briefly introduce themselves and the sort of explanation of the perspective that you're bringing to the panel today.
Okay, and will I get some slides? Is this the time we're going to do
Not
some?
quite yet, just intros first.
Okay. All right.
For you.
Okay, hi, I'm Alice Agogino. I'm retired, faculty emeritus from University of California, Berkeley. But then they give me a new title, so I'm also professor of the graduate school because I still run grants and mentor students. And look forward to talking to you all day.
So hello, everyone. Can you hear? Yes. Perfect. I'm Tamara Brown. I am also retired. As of the beginning of this month, I retired from Linde. I heard I heard earlier that I graduated. I spent the first 10 years of the first decade of my career in traditional medical design for devices, surgical devices. I spent the last 20 years or so of my career mostly in sustainability and research and development, and then retired as VP of Sustainability for Linde in industrial gases. So I'll talk, really happy to be here today with this panel, and I'll talk a little bit about medical devices and the importance of human rights from that perspective, but also as we emerge in a new clean energy economy and looking at applications, how human rights are really very important in that aspect. So very happy to learn and share today.
Hello, everyone. It's wonderful to be here. Thank you so much to the organizers for putting this together. My name's Shay. I'm coming here from Durham, North Carolina, where I lead the human rights practice at Cisco. I'm an attorney by training. I graduated from law school here in DC and then worked at a nonprofit organization for several years focused on corporate accountability. But roughly the last 10 years of my career has been focused on human rights in the technology industry, in-house at Yahoo and now at Cisco.
Hello, everybody, and thank you again to the organizers and to the staff for putting this event together. My name is Wendy Chun, and I am Canada 150 Research Chair in New Media at Simon Fraser University. I also direct the Digital Democracies Institute. I have a very interdisciplinary background, an undergraduate degree in systems design engineering, a PhD in English literature. I taught media theory and arts for 20 years, and now I'm in the social sciences. I run a cross-disciplinary institute, and I also chair the IPIE's panel on global standards for AI auditing.
Great. Okay, thank you. Just going to walk through some housekeeping things before we get into it. So the structure of the panel today, each of our panelists is going to give a short, around 5-minute presentation related to the topic of the day, and then we're going to do a bit of a sort of guided discussion among the group, and then we'll end with audience Q&A. And for those who are joining the session for the first time, we will be using the Slido platform, which if you are online, you can access on the same web page where you're watching this live stream right now by scrolling down to the discussion section. And in-person audience members can access that via their phones, scanning the QR code that is on your program. And you can submit questions at any time during the panel, as well as upvote questions that you like on Slido. And then in-person audience members are also welcome to just pose the questions here in person when we get to the Q&A. Okay, so let's kick it off with our presentations and start with Alice.
Okay, be glad to. Could we get the slide? Yeah. All right. So I'm going to be talking about integrating human rights in system design and product design. And if we could, I can go to the next slide. I have power. Okay. So I start out with a program that we developed, which is really based on the concept that development is freedom and is a human right. And as our Nobel laureate Sen said, it's really important that development place human rights at the front and the perspective of freedom at the center stage, because everyone has the human right to shape their own destiny and not have to just receive the destiny given to them. And so when we started a new program, I learned from one of my former PhD students, Yael Perez, who was an architecture student. I was mechanical engineering, and we were working together on sustainable housing. And she coined the term design as freedom, to go one step further to emphasize the importance of design and empowering people in the use of design. And that is the essence of a program we started called Development Engineering. And so in this program of development engineering, it's a transdisciplinary field that combines engineering, physical sciences, biological sciences, with social sciences, such as economics, entrepreneurship, business, public policy. And in fact, it was a group of faculty that all got together. I don't know about all universities have this because I've only taught at UC Berkeley. But Berkeley has the opportunity for faculty to start their own departments. It's called graduate groups. You're in your main home department as your discipline, but you can form new interdisciplinary departments. And so we really wanted to build on this design as freedom and development as freedom and make a degree program out of it. We called it development engineering because we wanted the engineering as in making things be part of it. And that we also wanted it, though, to accept students from any undergraduate major. We started a PhD minor with the idea that you should have a depth of concentration in your field, but you need the top part of the T to be cross-disciplinary. Ethics, cultural experiences, learning how to do project management, learning entrepreneurship, and so on. And so a concentration in some area, for a Master's of Engineering program, we have specific concentrations, and then the PhD minor could be any field across the campus. But what's really critical about development engineering is that it is based on an excellency across different disciplines and a tech-savvy coordination with teamwork. And here's our development model. You've seen similar design models like this everywhere. I think what's different about it is that we're always interested in being driven by development constraints and goals and understanding those, but also always thinking ahead to the future on how can we scale our development project. We don't just want to do a one-off or something that doesn't really make an impact. If you're going to solve poverty, you've got to think big. And we always cycle through working with co-designing with the people we're designing with. So whether it's observations, developing frameworks, imperatives, concepts, prototypes, and so on. And we always want a systems thinking perspective and ask tough questions in the design process. And so as part of the concept of design, and design being a human right and empower people to be able to co-design their own community and understand their goals, we need to question a lot of norms that members of the team might be coming into. So this is just, and Amy, maybe you could help me here. Could you pass these out? Sure. This is just a type of exercise that our transdisciplinary teams work on. And we could pass them out. I'd just like to get them back.
One to everyone.
Just let 1,000 flowers bloom. So we might ask questions like, what is the role of gender in the way you framed your problem? Is it breaking ground in gender equity, or is it just reproducing norms that already exist? And so the idea of the teams is they first come in with their own framing of the problem. They've identified a problem, they think they framed it, they think they know what they're going to work on. We have them ideate with ideas and solutions, and then we ask these reframing questions. And this is just an example of some of the reframing questions that we ask. And by the way, on the gender one, most teams don't think gender is a factor. And at the end of that exercise, they think everything is gendered, which is pretty much the case. So I'll give you another example of how framing has been very important in the work that I've done in development engineering. And I'm going to start out about 10 years ago. I had an opportunity to meet with tribal leaders with the Pinoleville Pomo Nation, which is a tribe that's about 2 to 3 hours north of UC Berkeley. And it was a very circuitous route that they came to me, but I usually work with communities on a lot of my design projects and my design courses, and so they wanted to pitch basically their problem to our class for our students to work on. They had a 90% unemployment rate. Most members of the tribe were in poverty. And the cost of energy had gone sky high that year. I forget why there was such a high cost on propane. And what little money they had was being spent on heating and cooling in these poorly insulated HUD trailers, basically. And you can see the trailer in the picture in the back with the truck in front of it and a propane tank there. And if we had started out with this framing, what we would have ended with was a better insulated trailer with maybe some native artwork. But instead, we took a step back and went back to design as freedom to try to understand what the aspirations and goals of this tribe really was in the long run. And I was helped by an excellent doctoral student of mine, Ryan Shelby, and I was just telling Wes that I knew his dean at Alabama A&M, and he called me and left a message on my tape recorder and said, Ryan is the best student I've ever had. You better hire him into graduate school. And I did. Always follow arts advice. And I'd like to just give a shout out to Ryan Shelby because his dissertation looked at much broader design, framing the problem, and then going ahead and working with the co-design and solving the problem. And so the way it was defined ultimately was we were going to co-design and co-build culturally sensitive, sustainable homes with a focus on energy, water systems, native plants coupled with green job training, and it was a learning experience for everyone involved. And in fact, a very younger version of me is there in the building. It was a rice straw house, and so you can see a younger version of me. And right next to me is that Ryan Shelby, who was a fellow here at the National Academy of Engineering when he got out of college. He went and led a major operation for USAID in Africa, I think about 10 countries, and now he's back in DC working as a liaison with Congress for USAID. But I really value the work he's done, and what he did is frame it as their goals is tribal sovereignty, economic independence, and environmental harmony. And so you see a much different outcome depending on how the problem is actually framed. And we were just really honored that the Smithsonian Institute Museum of the American Indian basically did a case study of us on this project and just felt very honored that they would do that. So all members, I'm finishing up, all members that work on the co-design and co-build teams learn, and that's a critical aspect of making this work out, is everyone learns. I've started working on a new project with indigenous communities more broadly in food, energy, water systems, and I'm learning about indigenous research methods. And here's just some examples of the kind of values they have with indigenous research methods. But I leave you with this last thought, and the one that really struck me what I'm learning from. One of the methods is to say, what will be the impact of your research 7 generations from now? When do we in school think about 7 generations? But they're thinking of a sustainable long view. Will we be good ancestors with the project we're looking at?
I really like that. Thanks, Alice. Next up, Tamara. Getting your slides. Yes.
Okay, wonderful. So I love the way that you ended, Alice, talking about kind of what is it that we want, what do we foresee the result of our design 7 generations from now, and sustainability. So this conference, I'll start off by saying, is an interesting part because, as I mentioned, about 30 years ago, I started my career in medical device development. Earlier this month, I ended my career at Linde in sustainability, and I spent, probably 2 decades in research and development and in sustainability and really helping to protect our ecosystems, making our communities more resilient, making our products more resilient and safer, and there for the long term. And as I started thinking about this topic today, it really gave me a chance to really reflect about the career. So if I can, oh, I just thought I'd move my hand and it was just going to. So I want to start off really with just a framework of a bit of my career, and it was very interesting how you began, because I thought about, as I was preparing some notes, that when I sat in my biomedical engineering or chemical engineering class, I was a double major at Vanderbilt in 1989, there was no formal mention of human factors really in our design, and certainly not human rights in the design process. I do recall some anecdotal mentions from at least one professor that really started me thinking about, as you were developing medical devices, the historical perceptions and the bias that was introduced in terms of equity, and feeling that different groups racially didn't experience pain, and how that informed not only the devices, but how it also informed treatment. But those were anecdotal mentions. Later, as I started my graduate work several years later, we started to see human factors, more of the human factors in terms of formal training. And then later, certainly, that increased as we saw an emphasis on clinical implications, making sure that we have, as we conduct clinical trials, that we have a population that's representative. We also then, and I was pleased, so kind of midway in my career or a little bit later in my career, I currently sit on the advisory board for biomedical engineering at Wendy, and I'm always pleased to see the students now informed in their design around biomimicry and looking at patterns of indigenous medicine, traditional medicine, to think about solving problems and to inform. And so we certainly are making steps, and I think that that those steps are very positive. And certainly in the clean energy space, there is a lot of emphasis, if we move from products to applications, around Justice 40, equity initiatives, making sure that people not only are part of the testing, but that they are aware that they can operate our new applications safely, that they understand the benefits, and more importantly, that they can participate in those benefits, reap the benefits from that, economically improve their quality of life, and help participate in the workforce. And certainly returning back just this year, earlier this year, at Vandy, as a part of the advisory board, I was walking through that same campus and saw large pillars of signs introducing formal discussions for medical technology and medical science training on the importance of uncovering bias as you are beginning research in a very formal setting and introducing university-wide conversations. So certainly in just my 30 years of a career or so, the trajectory of human rights in this discussion is very important. But all of us here and everyone sitting here or listening in the virtual space, we all are engineers. You all you're engineers, or you are part of that creative process. And we all began for that same reason that I started in 1989. You wanted to make a difference. It's the same way that as I ended, at least that part of my career at Linde, that I want to make a difference. And so I would suggest that as we talk about human rights and how this fits kind of on the design table, that it's not an addition to what we do. It really is why we came to the table in the first place. Because if you want to solve the right problem, we want to do it the right way. And you can't do that without considering human rights. And I think that is it's so powerful that that you're having this conversation, because this isn't an extra, this is what we do. So thinking about that, I want to give just 2 or 3 quick examples of how we've seen that. And going back to medical devices, and I think kind of in the backdrop, you really can't see them, but I think if you think about how human rights span, and if you're wondering, how do I introduce this? And I know Lindsey's going to actually talk about some formal ways to assess human rights in the design effort. But human rights, the issues that we talk about, the social issues, are everywhere. I think we know those. And so, I think first, every time we're starting a design effort, think about the efforts. And I'm going to give a couple of places where perhaps these are one apparent and maybe not so apparent. But certainly in medical devices, for us, one of my earliest memories in terms of beta testing is making sure not only that you have a population. I think there's a lot of focus on having a population that's representative. We know that in cardiac health that's very important. Having a team of folks that are assessing and analyzing those results is also very important, because we know that those disparities exist, and they exist in all sorts of in all sorts of applications. Blood clots, thrombosis. The treatment of patients is very different as we look at different diseases and different clinical presentations. But also, when we look at the centers with which we do work, that is also important. And so it's very important to involve historically Black universities, involve indigenous populations, bringing folks to the table that can help inform the problem and also help to inform the solution. When we look at the clean energy space, and so again, I'll go to something that's not a product that you can kind of touch or feel exactly, but we all are looking at combating climate change, this clean energy revolution coming in over the next decade or so. And that is going to challenge not only the products that we use, so when we talk about electric vehicles or hydrogen vehicles, but also how people perceive those as safe or not, how they interact, and how they also are able to participate in those economies. And so if we want to develop applications that are very successful, we can't develop those applications and leave communities behind. Those communities also need to participate and to be comfortable enough to participate, adopt those technologies, ask questions about those technologies, inform those technologies, have the freedom to inform those technologies, and then to participate in those technologies. And then finally, the final example that I'll give is that, sometimes it's hard to see what the difference is. And I want to share just a picture, 2 pictures that show, maybe at first glance, 2 groups of children that look perhaps very similar if you take a quick glance. But there is a huge, stark difference, and it is a part of design, especially product design, that I think sometimes we as engineers often underemphasize. We think about the wonders, and there are wonders of material selection, and so certainly in my earlier years in designing medical devices, materials were very important. And we were always very proud of materials that are easier, that respond to body temperature, that are easy to bend, that are less invasive, that are less harmful. But we also have to step back and think about from where did those materials derive. And so as we all use cell phones, and we use devices, medical devices, all of our devices, just consumer devices are filled of electronics. That also means that they are also full often of materials that are derived from conflict regions. And those materials, the little people who are mining those materials are little people, and we want that picture on the right to be more like that picture on the left for their reality. And so there is enough brain power in this room and around all of your design tables to also think about how do we power the devices that we need, that we've come to live, to think that we can't live without, and that also provide enormous benefit in terms of clinical benefit from an electronic standpoint. But how do we find safer alternatives that don't rely on that picture on the right in the value chain, in the product value chain? That is the next human rights challenge for all of us who are sitting here today. And so when we talk about impactful, intentional design, it's a win-win-win. And I'll use just kind of quickly the construct that we think about in sustainability. We have better inputs to inform that design. We have outputs that are clearly superior in terms of their technical performance, but also are more effective because they're effective over a vast, a more reliable, a relevant population. And then we have outcomes that are not only those clinical outcomes, but also hopefully outcomes that affect quality of life, not just for the people who are using those, but for all the people in the chain. And so my final thought really is, there are three quotes that I always use for talks like this. And one of those, I have to go back to dear Albert Einstein, who said that concern for man, and I'm going to say for people, must always be the chief interest in all of our technical endeavors. Never forget that in the midst of your diagrams and equations. Thank you.
Thank you. And I think a good transition over to Katie.
Great, thank you so much. And I love that point about the win-win-win. And I want to also bring it back to something Lindsey said in, okay, sorry, I'm distracted by the slides. But at the beginning, Lindsey, you said something about choices. And when I reflect on what brought me to this field and what really energizes me about it is that this is really about decision making and the choices that we have when we're building technology that we put out into the world. And there are thousands, millions of decisions that we make that go into each of these products. What I love about bringing a human rights framework to this is that it's I have found it to be very practical and a framework that applies sort of regardless of context or regardless of what the issue is that you're working on. So I'm going to present today about how Cisco has applied the human rights framework in the context of our responsible AI program. Before I get into the specifics of it, I want to just highlight that this was a program we put together in 2018-2019 timeframe. So that feels to me like ages ago at this point. But a lot has changed. It really wasn't that long ago, but a lot has changed. And the AI that we are leveraging in the company now is in some ways the same and in some ways different than what we were thinking about back when we were designing the program. We have generative AI now much more widely available than we did when we were designing this. But one of the things, the real takeaways for us has been that we could take the framework that we put together for a predictive AI environment and apply it in a generative AI environment with very positive results. So there are new challenges coming up for us on the generative AI side that are more like legal challenges. They're not really new human rights challenges. And so this has, having this framework in place and grounding it in human rights principles has really benefited, I think, our company in our ability to respond to new challenges as well as our customers and end users. So it has been win-win-win. Okay, so I mentioned that we started this in 2018, 2019, and I wanted to just provide a little bit of history and some specific information about what the steps were that we took along the way. I joined Cisco in 2018, having worked in a human rights program at Yahoo, and was advocating in Cisco to develop a dedicated human rights program that would apply the UN guiding principles on business and human rights across our corporate decision-making and corporate functions. And we had a human rights policy going back to 2012. I'm going to shout out to BSR for helping develop that back in the early days, as well as some positions that Cisco had taken on sort of hot topics, big tech and human rights issues, including AI, which BSR also helped draft. So in 2018, when we got a question from a customer asking, how are you thinking about responsible AI? We had a little bit there from a human rights perspective. We had some thoughts that we had put out, but we wanted to go deeper and make it a really practical approach within the company. So we put together a cross-functional effort, to Alice's point. It really needs to be a cross-disciplinary exercise. We brought together privacy, security, and human rights to design a responsible AI program. We didn't want to just put principles out into the world. We wanted there to be something on the back end. So if you look under the hood, so to speak, there was something really meaty there. And so we worked with our engineers to understand how they went about designing and building our technology. They use something called the Cisco Secure Development Lifecycle, which is basically a set of requirements that all of our engineers have to follow when they're building something for Cisco customers. And so we worked with engineers to design requirements within that broader requirement set that were specific to AI development and that incorporated that human rights perspective. Once we got some of that back-end work done, we launched a governance program with executive sponsorship from our engineering department, but representation across the company. And we published a set of principles to share with our customer base and other stakeholders exactly how we were thinking about responsible AI. This was done because it needed to happen, and there were a group of employees within the company that saw the need and got it done. But I'm very proud to say that about a year ago, we actually hired a team to do this as their full-time job. So we now have a resourced AI governance team that is responsible for our principles. They do our AI assessments, and they bring issues to the governance board for review. We have 6 AI principles. You can find them on our website. They're transparency, fairness, accountability, privacy, security, and reliability. There are human rights themes that run throughout each of these, but I will highlight for you privacy and fairness as the 2 that are very much top of mind for myself and my team. Privacy, because privacy in itself is a human right, and we know that with all the data that Cisco collects and will collect through the use of our AI features, some of that information would be of interest to governments. And so we want to make sure that we are applying privacy by design throughout this as well, minimizing the data that we collect, only keeping it for as long as we need, and having robust processes in place so that when governments do come asking for it, we have a way of responding that is respectful of people's human rights as well. And then fairness really comes to the human right to be free from discrimination. And a lot of times we refer to that as bias, and I'll share some examples of how that has come up at Cisco and how we've thought about it, some of the things that we've learned in addressing bias in our products as well. And then just quickly on our responsible AI framework, I mentioned we have a governance committee that is a cross-functional committee, but with heavy representation from engineering that meets monthly to review high-risk use cases, new issues that are coming up, as well as just how is the program running? Where are we getting stuck? Where is there inefficiency? Where can we do better? And then, let's put some processes in place to improve. Controls, I mentioned our Cisco Secure Development Lifecycle. So having requirements that our engineers have to meet when they're designing and building, as well as our AI assessments, which are similar to privacy impact assessments if you're familiar with those. But it's essentially a questionnaire that our engineers complete, and then there's a back and forth with them where we assess risks and give them mitigation strategies to address those risks before they ship the product. One other thing that I want to highlight is our incident management framework. So we, at Cisco, we've had a leading privacy and security program for many, many years. And we decided to take our privacy incident process and our security incident process and design an AI incident process based on those. So this is mainly focused on bias, but if an individual or group identifies an issue, there's a channel that they can come through and let us know there's a potential bias issue, and we treat that as if it's a security incident and have a process in place for dealing with that. In the interest of time, I'm just going to give one example here, and maybe I can come back to some others. But I'll highlight the virtual background application, which is in our WebEx product, a video collaboration tool, if you're not familiar with it, similar to, well, I won't name our competitors. But I'm sure you're all familiar with virtual backgrounds. Of course, we offer this product globally, and we want it to work for the broadest population that it possibly could work for. But one thing that we identified before releasing the virtual background feature was that it was not working well for everyone. People with different hair textures and hairstyles or lighting conditions had different experiences. And what our engineers identified that I thought was very interesting was, of course, they needed to add more differentiated data into the training data set that they were using. But one thing that was unexpected was that having a disproportionate amount of training data from women made a huge difference in the overall efficacy of the feature, regardless of whether the person using it was a man or woman. And that just had to do with the wide variation in women's hairstyles. And I like this example because, I sort of had, before I learned this from our engineers, I sort of had an assumption that a training data set that's sort of reflective of the population that you're trying to serve would result in equitable outcomes, and that wasn't the case. We actually needed to build bias into the training data set by biasing it toward women in order to have a more equitable outcome for women, men, non-binary individuals. And so I just like that example, and we can come back to it, but to highlight that sometimes you actually want to engineer for bias. It's not always that bias is harmful. You want to address harmful bias, but sometimes you need to actually build it in order for to get the equitable outcome.
But you have more diversity in hairstyles.
Yeah. Exactly, yeah. Mm-hmm. And I will wrap there. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. All right, we'll end with Wendy.
Hi. So I do not use PowerPoint, and so I'm standing up, and hopefully my screen will show. So I'm excited to be here with my panelists to think about how we can integrate human rights principles into systems and product design. And for my very brief opening comments, what I want to outline is how, is the mic not on, or? Oh, it's on. So what I just want to outline is how human values, the humanities, and the social sciences are already embedded into system and product design through our technical defaults. So it's not that we have to add human values or transdisciplinary concerns to engineering, but that we need to embed better human values. And we need to engage other disciplines more intentionally because we borrow from each other badly all the time. And this is also why we come into these crises and issues. So to make this very concrete, I'm going to talk about social media algorithms and homophily. So homophily is the axiom that similarity breeds connection, that birds of a feather flock together. Homophily, which is also love of the same, grounds recommendation systems. It grounds social media networks, nearest neighbor algorithms, as well as word embeddings, which ground large language models. And this is why, if you like this, you'll get recommended something that's like this. And also why, if you're deemed to be like someone, like X, you'll get similar recommendations. So basically, it's through homophily that we're clustered into network neighborhoods. But what's key is not everything you like is weighted equally. So your most valuable likes are those that are slightly controversial, that are polarizing, right? Or slightly strange. So, for example, liking Harry Potter, not very useful. Liking Napoleon Dynamite, right? Now that's useful, right? And early on, likes were weighted by controversy. So the hate button was weighted far more heavily than the like button. So what this means is that echo chambers aren't an unfortunate error, they're the goal, right? So agitated clusters of comforting rage are a goal. Because what people hate together draws them together, even as it agitates them. So I always think about this in terms of that classic physics experiment where you take a bunch of iron filings and put the magnet underneath, right? What you produce is a network, right? So, and at each cluster, individual filings repel each other, but they cling together because of their overriding attraction or hate of the other, right? Now, not surprisingly, US residential segregation is often given as evidence of the naturalness of homophily. And so here you see a discussion of homophily from one of the best textbooks in network science, right? So traveling through a metropolitan area, one finds that homophily produces a natural spatial signature. Well, as many people have shown, US residential segregation isn't an accident, right? It was carefully planned and engineered through laws, highway construction, covenants, race-based mortgages, et cetera. And the other thing we have to recall is that this is a really bizarre example because the links between homophily and US residential segregation are deep and profound. So the very term homophily emerged from a study of US residential segregation, right? So homophily was coined in a widely cited, this article is cited by everyone but read by no one, right? A highly cited article by the sociologists Robert K. Merton and Carl Lazarsfeld. And they studied two housing projects. One was Craft Town, a project cooperatively owned of seven white 100 families in New Jersey. It's still going now. It's called Winfield, New Jersey, so these were all code names. And Hilltown, which was Addison Terrace, a biracial low-rent project of about 800 families in western Pennsylvania. And they chose housing projects because they were open sites of social engineering. So they said these openly are blatantly about social engineering. It's a human laboratory. People had very few rights to privacy. And also because there was a huge housing crisis going on back then. And there was a debate as to whether we needed to build more public housing or to have privately funded mortgages, right? Now, I say this was highly cited but rarely read because the authors just didn't coin the term homophily. They also coined the term heterophily. And they didn't presume homophily to be always true. In fact, they were skeptical that birds of the feather always flock together. And so they asked, when does homophily happen and when does heterophily happen? Now, they did, as you see here, posit the existence of value homophily among white residents in Hilltown, because white liberals overselected white liberals as one of their three closest friends, and white illiberals did the same. So you were considered to be a liberal if you thought housing projects should be biracial and the races got along, and you were considered to be illiberal if you thought the opposite. But to make this point, and here you see the eureka moment from the archive, they actually threw out the responses of the largest category of white residents. And those were so-called ambivalents, who believed that the project should not be biracial, but everyone got along. And they also threw out all the responses of black residents, right? So they presumed in advance that values don't cross racial boundaries and that polarization always won out, that ambivalence would have to become either liberal or illiberal. Now, again, they stressed that these weren't the only relations. And in the never published actual report on which the article was based, they said that the over-selection of white illiberals for each other wasn't statistically significant, and that black and white residents did have friends and acquaintances of other races, right? So what homophily does, and homophily is the only principle, the grounding principle of these networks, is that it erases a good deal of the world we live in. And so here you see a model that Karina Albrecht, who's a brilliant PhD student in the Institute, produced in which these connections were added back, right? Because different species of birds do flock together. And as a question, how many of you people know people who are heterosexual? Right. So in a world of absolute gender homophily, this is impossible. Right? So think about electricity. It goes from negative to positive. And the Jacquard index for antonyms is actually very high. Right? So what can happen if we work intentionally across disciplines to build models that engage the entire range of human experiences? When we start with the gaps that are central to networks. And what's so important to network science is it's actually the gap through which ties can emerge, right? So the gap is absolutely central. But these gaps aren't empty, but filled with voices that have been erased but still remain. So think of all that data that's there. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay.
Oh, yeah, so that was Addison Terrace. So those were the folks in Addison Terrace.
Okay, so we're going to move into our discussion, which I'm going to trim down quite a bit so that we don't eat into all of the Q&A time. So I'm going to ask a couple different questions, and for the panelists, definitely no need to respond to each of them. But I'll start with raising a common theme sort of throughout everyone's remarks, which was the value of integrating human rights into the product design process, actually making products better, the win-win-win, it's good for everyone. And I'd love to hear some tangible examples of that in practice, if any of you have any to share.
Well, they're all, I mean...
Yeah, any specific example that comes to mind? You've essentially shared one as part of your remarks, but yeah, any specific example that comes to mind?
Well, I think it's not the product. I think my perspective is on the people that, is on, are you serving in the co-design process, are you serving the people you're designing with? So one product might be good for one group of people, but not uniformly good. So that's why, I think about that question. It really depends on who you're working with and what your goals are.
Yeah. I think there are just so many examples of this. Another one that's coming to mind is I'm looking at you with these closed captions behind you. I'm assuming these are AI-powered captions because they're live. No, they're not? Okay. So apologies to whoever's doing the caption. They're very good. But a lot of our products do have AI-generated captions. And so, having a focus on sort of the accessibility impacts there and really making sure that they're of high quality also benefits people who might be joining a call from the security line at the airport or, wherever you are where you might just not have the audio on or you're, somewhere noisy or you have construction in the background, whatever the issue is, it has wider reaching benefits for a population that you may not be thinking that you're designing for because you're thinking about accessibility benefits in the design.
And so I guess, this is the foundation of universal design, though. That designing, for one population can reach a whole broader population because you're making it easier to use or you have good UX features or something like that.
Yeah, actually, it's a great transition to the next question I had, which was related to another common theme from you all, which is the importance of considering sort of the broader context of the people you're designing a product for. their identity groups, cultural contexts, political contexts, and involving them as much as possible in product design. And I know there is an adage in tech, at least, that designing for the sort of most vulnerable populations makes a product that works well for everyone. So I would love to hear a little bit more of everyone's thoughts about how you can do that in practice, and how that might look different for an effort working with a specific community and designing something for them versus something that might have like a global base of customers or users.
So I guess I'm going to take two spins on that a little bit. I think first, it's really important to know the population. So I think as the first step of design is really understanding what the problem is. And I think that even sometimes we think we know what a problem, or we have a set of problems that we are trying to tackle, but even being open and vulnerable to going out to saying, okay, let's reach out and try to understand the problem from the perspective of people who are dealing with that condition or dealing with the issue. So really defining the problem itself is, I think, very important, and to have diversity in that process. And I think that certainly from a kind of having spent a lot of time in corporate, but also from a research standpoint, I mean, I think that that's the fundamental. But then certainly as you have a sense of the problem, whether it's a disease state that you're trying to address, or a housing issue, or kind of a consumer product, that making sure that that you have folks at the table that are diverse, that are representative in terms of not just gender and race, but also their abilities, what they understand, kind of how they view technology, how they view products, the use of products is important or not important, and to use that to inform the design.
So we're working with some folks, in particular Caroline and Michael Runningwolf, who are working on indigenous language reclamation and trying to build different kinds of large language models and natural language processing techniques. And what's absolutely key is the indigenous language sovereignty and indigenous data sovereignty, so that they own the data, it's not taken over, et cetera, and trying to think through these and the conditions that some of the elders have put forward in terms of giving their story. So one person said, we'll give you our story, but you can't break it up at all. Right? You can't tokenize it at all. Has meant a lot of interesting challenges, but for all of us, we will benefit from this insistence on data sovereignty and the ways in which other folks, such as Yuto Trevineris, is working with people who use BlissBot, which is a language used by people who don't speak but have a lot to say, and they use symbolics in certain ways, but they're not simply additive. And they've been trying to rethink large language models as well. What do you do when you don't have that kind of additive language model? And so I think there's a lot of innovation, a lot of ways in which people are rethinking engineering and putting privacy and ownership at the heart of it.
And a related sort of follow-up question, and Tamara, you had a sort of diagram of like the life cycle of a product up there. Obviously, most of the time there's sort of a specific process that is followed when developing a product or a system, and that obviously might look different in different contexts, but they seem to always start with some sort of like problem definition, moving on to, conceptualizing the product, actually building it, and then launching it out into the world. And I imagine it might be helpful for folks to hear a little bit about how human rights considerations might differ along those different stages, or sort of what kinds of things you should be thinking about very early in the process versus, closer to a launch, for example. So if you have any tangible examples there, that would be great.
Well, I just want to make one comment. I don't think of design as being a linear process, though. Starting step for step. It's really almost a spiral. that's going on. And so you're always checking in with someone every step of the way. But as part of the spiral, like the life cycle analysis as well, I think is something that uniformly we would look at the whole production process and what's been its impact on not only the local community but the global community. And looking at life cycle assessment, I think, is critical in any product that you're developing. I should also say one other thing. When I think of design and when we work in our transdisciplinary teams, a design can be a physical product, it can be a building, it could be a space, it could be software, it could be an algorithm, it could be a user interface, but it could be a policy or it could be a business model. All of those of one form or another really are design systems. And so I think the same guidelines that we've been talking about apply to all types of designs. And usually it's some combination of all of those.
I agree. It should go throughout the life cycle, and we're always sort of learning about how the technology is being used and what the impact is. And the other thing that I'll mention, the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights that I mentioned in my prepared remarks used a framework of scale, scope, and severity of harm. And so there's a prioritization of risks and mitigations that also takes place as part of the human rights assessment. And I think this is also important to note because practically, I will be in conversations with engineers and we'll highlight some risks that we've identified as part of our risk assessment. And I will always get the question, which of these are going to block me from launching? Right? And so the way I hear that, like they have pressure that they're under. And so my task is to help them understand which of these are the most critical to address on the shortest time frame, and how do we work together to address the risks in a way that's also, responsive to what the business is trying to do, and put products out into the world that we also think are very good for the world. There are human rights opportunities that we're trying to serve as well. And so there will, there may be some where we say, okay, these are critical to solve before you launch. There are others that, like, this should go on your roadmap. These are things that you can be working on and iterating on, where there's an opportunity for mitigation, but maybe the likelihood of the impact is low, and so we can sort of work through that with them.
I have a question on that, because when I think of what we're value added to a user and then looking at risks, it would seem to be a different cognitive process. But I think you have to be just as creative in looking at possible risks as you are when you're looking at the original product. Mm-hmm. And that takes time.
Yes. Yes, it does.
Yeah, and we're going to practice that in our practice session coming up. I think with that, I'll move to the Q&A portion. So I think someone's passing around a mic. I think we'll try to collect maybe like 3 questions at a time, and then if there's any on the Slido to raise also. Yeah, so whoever wants to start.
So Glenn Diger from the University of Michigan. If we frame this as, which I think you have, but as the design process. And design is not just conceptualizing, but getting it all the way to implementation. What's our biggest constraint? So do we not know, so looking at the best in class, do we not know how to do it? If you look at those that are good practice, do they need to elevate? Do we need to? So is it we don't know what to do, or we're just not doing it consistently enough in terms of actually achieving the outcome that we're looking for here?
What department are you in?
Civil and environmental engineering.
And let's take a couple questions at once, and then maybe we can.
Hi there. Thanks very much. This was a wonderful panel. I'm Rebecca Everly from the Committee on Human Rights at the National Academies, and I have a question for Katie, but then maybe for many of you as well. So, specifically, Katie, you're a lawyer, a human rights expert who's working within a company, and you work with engineers. And I'm curious, though, whether the engineers with whom you work are themselves have knowledge of human rights principles? And if they don't, what would it matter for you as someone working within Cisco to be working with engineers who have a base of knowledge on human rights? Thanks.
Okay, I'm up. Betsy Popkin, UC Berkeley Human Rights Center. This question is predominantly directed towards Katie and Lindsey, but I'm curious whether others have thoughts. You know, Cisco is a big company that had resources to devote to developing responsible AI principles and putting policies and practices into place. There are a lot of small organizations, even one-person organizations, developing new AI products all the time. What would you suggest, you know, for those with fewer resources, how would you suggest they approach kind of the area of responsible AI or embedding human rights principles into the development of AI with very few resources?
Okay, let's start with that first question, I think, about the biggest constraint in the design process related to integrating human rights, whether we don't know what to do or we just aren't doing it or what.
I'll tackle that a little, just give a couple of perspectives. And I think it's tied a little bit with Rebecca's question. You know, I think that first there's a lack of awareness. You know, I think, so that's why I think this is very important. Certainly you see it more now, and certainly as I look at senior design students' work, that they're more informed about and they care more about social and economic justice and environmental justice. But I think in terms of formal training and how you put that to work, I think any of them could do a HAZOP or a safety analysis in FMEA, but they wouldn't necessarily be able to translate that over to a human right. So I think it's the awareness, having a practical way to do that that comes from their engineering education. But I also think, and that of course affects the staff that's in a company. But from a corporate perspective, I also think it's just cost. I think that certainly the tools can be used. I think that there's a lot of training in corporate environments, but I think that it's up to corporations and for all of us who are in this work and for folks who are leading sustainability, R&D, and engineering to really put this emphasis and to realize that sometimes with that cost, that's not only a cost of money, but it's usually a cost of time, because there's always going to be the imperative that similar to a safety issue or a technical issue, something being less reliable, that we need a solution, we need to implement that, we need to go back and test, and that testing needs to be very comprehensive and is often not very straightforward, not as straightforward as some of the things. So I think that that's just a learning curve we have to get over, but it really is cost.
I think it's an interesting question to think about within context. That's why I want to know what department you are from and how you might.
I'm a water person. I do water.
Okay. Well,
Good water, yes.
and I think that's a good case in point. Getting water from point A to B in India, where it may be contaminated in the pipes along the ways. And so we know how to produce clean water. But it's the context of getting that clean water to the human being and fitting into this kind of system. One of our development engineering projects was in Uganda on recycling plastic. Plastics were everywhere. You can recycle them and make them something useful. But people were just burning them in their yards to get rid of all the plastic, cause pollution in the air and everything else. But we know how to do that. I mean, there are all kinds of different machines that we can get that recycle plastic. But do we have a machine that's efficient, say, for a small scale, for a small village? And so all the engineering principles and physics principles are there, but nobody's done it for a small village. And so you have to rethink the whole manufacturing process in a new context.
Lindsey, can I just say one thing about water, because I get very excited about water. So there's another reason, and I because I think it's also cool for all of us to start thinking about, but so water in many areas of the world is scarce. So when I think of human rights issues, I think about water scarcity in the areas. And so as we, as chemical engineers, as we're developing products that use water, an important design consideration is what is the burden of those designs on the water that is increasingly scarce in areas where we're putting those applications. And so, and definitely as we are planning, one of my last proud things was to introduce some goals around our own water stewardship. But, or Lindy's own water stewardship, it's not mine anymore. But the interesting thing is that I think, so even as we're thinking about mechanical designs or plant designs, we also have to think about how those designs are using water and how can we make them use less water, less burden, because the use of less water is less of a burden on those water scarce communities.
Rebecca, thank you for your question about working with engineers. Most of the engineers that I work with do not have a background in human rights. We've been working to get them trained up, and so over the years, more of them are sort of conversant in the issues that we're talking about. But yes, it would make a huge difference, and I hope that's probably the answer that you also wanted to hear. But yeah, it would make a difference. Because it would just like speed up the conversation, and we'd be speaking the same language from the beginning. And I think engineers would be thinking about this stuff from a human rights framework earlier on in the process, which would be very, very beneficial. I think, though, I also want to give credit, because I think all of the engineers that I have had the pleasure of working with really are doing the work that they do because they want to have a positive impact. And they are thinking about this stuff in their own way. They may just not have the human rights language or framework. And so I have found that there's a tremendous appetite to work with my team, because they want someone who can meet them there and sort of help show them the way and give them the framework for doing the analysis and the mitigation. So I think there's a lot of opportunity there. And I would love to see courses applying the UNGP's framework in engineering schools. I would also love to see more classes like the work that you're doing, Alice, with students. And, even the work that you've presented, it's not directly applicable to Cisco engineering projects, right? At least the example you provided. But I think we have worked with Cisco. Oh, that's great. So we should do more. And what I was going to say was, even I think having the opportunity for engineers to work more with communities, even if it's not something that they're going to be directly calling, an experience that they'll be calling from in their day-to-day job, but just having gone through the process of interacting with communities, doing some fact-finding, understanding perspective would be hugely beneficial. And I'll use that to also segue into Betsy's comment, but I know you want to come in, Alice. Just in terms of like what would be helpful for smaller teams, the cards that Alice passed around, like having something like that available in your company. We call them personas. Like, who are you designing for? And sort of going through an exercise of, okay, I'm going to pretend that this person's using my product. How are they going to be impacted by it? Then also think about who you actually are designing for and do the same process. On the security side, engineers would be very familiar with red teaming. Like, you can red team for human rights impacts as well. And so just sort of building some of this stuff into the design process and the processes that are already there shouldn't actually take a lot of resourcing. It takes a little bit of time to set it up. But then once it's there and teams are using it, then, maybe I'm naive, but I think that it would go quite well.
I don't know how much this has changed, but I do think there is a problem that most engineers don't enjoy their work. And that's why we are getting students wanting to come back to have meaningful, I was I was president of the Santa Clara Society of Mechanical Engineers many, many years ago when I worked for General Electric. And most of those guys, they're almost all guys then, were actually unhappy. They had no control over what they were not empowered. They didn't have their own human rights in their own company that they're working with. Now, I know that's changed, but I think it is a challenge to look at the context of the work environment so that it promotes these kinds of openness and human rights issues as well. And engineers will be subject to law if they're in a discipline that has rules of ethics and requires some kind of professional registration. Then they'll have kind of narrowly defined things they can't do in liability they have to look at. But I think we need to empower our engineers within companies.
Absolutely, and to return it back to the workshops and community engagement, it's often through these workshops and community engagements and working with artists that we find that a lot of the engineers are so excited and they feel empowered to rethink these defaults. So when I talk about homophily to a very large search engine company, which I won't name, all the engineers were shocked and they were like, yes, let's think up different defaults. It's a challenge. It's something that they want to take up. So I think having that kind of interdisciplinary work, we work with artists, we have probe kits, we work with communities, and this goes back to what was said in the morning session, working with communities, rethinking our defaults, being empowered to not simply take what we're given and think that's designing with this, but let's imagine some other tools. And making that part of our education and everyday process is absolutely key.
And I think that's probably a great point to end on. So thank you, everyone.
Thank you all very much. And before we take our break, there were a number of questions that I think I had answered for me in the session that some of you asked. And I want to highlight two things in particular. Alice and Tamara, you both gave examples of, and correct me if I'm wrong, of leadership from the top. When you laid out Linde's, even at Cisco, but everywhere where you had a successful program, and you implied that it was successful. So I'm going to take you at your word. It was because it was a program that was either started at the top or adopted at the top. And so I think one of the things that's incumbent on all of us worker bees is to have the courage to go to the leadership and say, can we think about doing this to adjust the way we do business? Because human rights is really important. And if you want to get down to it, it is about money, because it's what the finance people will tell you. You're weighing the risk against the benefit. Do we have enough money to pay for the lawsuits that we're going to get when we violate these human rights principles? And we should get out of that. We should not let that be the argument. I had when I was at NASA, two of the people who were key to me were my head of safety and mission assurance and my general counsel, my lawyer. And I would go to them with some crazy ideas sometimes about things we wanted to do, and they both had this yes if philosophy. And it would go back to the question that you, who asked it? Katie, somebody asked you, which of these is going to, no, you said, an engineer asked you, which of these is going to block me from launching? That's a yes if question. And I think what you told him, I'm putting words in your mouth, was we can do this, but here's what we need to do to get there on time. We have lots of examples. We have one big example today that shall go unnamed because I don't want to do that. But in my business, in the space business, because they lost the human rights, the quality and safety and everything else, and went to the profit motive, and they're paying the price now. And because it's a matter of culture, it's a matter of the culture of the company. So when we go to our bosses, we should say, look, our company has a certain identification or a certain culture, and we want to maintain that. And if we're not careful, we'll lose it. And human rights, a company that is known for thinking about human rights or thinking about those kinds of values, I think, gains the respect of the community writ large and is a much better company along the way. This has been incredibly beneficial to me personally, and hopefully to everybody else, and hopefully sets us up to go into the exercise that's coming up. And this will probably be the last time you see me, because I'm going to sit back and watch and participate. Thanks very much.